There is a moment after the last message is sent or never sent at all when the world feels strangely still. No notifications, no explanations, no final words to lean on. When you and the narcissist both stop contacting each other, the silence can feel like an unanswered question hanging in the air. You may tell yourself this is what closure looks like, yet inside, nothing feels closed. At first, the quiet is unsettling. You keep listening for emotional footsteps that no longer arrive. Your mind replays old conversations, not because you want to return, but because your system is adjusting to the absence of noise. Silence feels heavy because it replaces a dynamic that once consumed your emotional space. And in that stillness, something unexpected begins to stir. This is not the dramatic ending you imagined. There is no collapse, no apology, no sudden clarity. Instead, there is distance. And distance has a way of revealing truths that closeness never allowed. What follows is not about who reaches out first or who appears stronger on the surface. It is about what unfolds internally when the dynamic finally loses oxygen. Because when both of you stop reaching, the relationship does not simply end, it transforms. And what happens next, quietly and profoundly, is what changes everything. When both people stop contacting each other, it is easy to assume that silence means balance, that two individuals are moving on in parallel, healing at the same pace, arriving at the same emotional destination. But mutual silence is rarely mutual healing. The absence of communication may look equal on the surface, yet internally, vastly different processes are unfolding. Silence is a shared behavior, not a shared experience, and confusing the two can delay true recovery. For someone who has been entangled with a narcissist, silence often feels like withdrawal before it feels like freedom. The body has grown accustomed to emotional highs and lows, to unpredictability, to the constant scanning for approval or threat. When contact stops, the nervous system does not immediately relax. Instead, it protests. There may be anxiety, restlessness, intrusive thoughts, and an urge to reach out simply to restore familiarity. This discomfort is not a sign that the relationship was healthy or meaningful. It is evidence of how deeply the emotional system was conditioned to survive within instability. On the other side, the narcissist's silence is rarely about processing pain or reflecting inward. It is often strategic or avoidant. Silence becomes a way to regain power, to punish, to wait, or to provoke curiosity. Healing requires self-examination, accountability, and emotional tolerance, all of which are deeply threatening to a narcissistic structure. So while there may be no contact, there is also no true integration of loss. The silence is filled with narratives that protect the ego rather than challenge it. This is why silence can feel so confusing for the person who is actually trying to heal. You may imagine the other person changing, missing you, growing, arriving at insight simply because they are no longer present. But healing is not passive. Time alone does not create growth. Awareness does. And silence without self-awareness often becomes a holding pattern rather than a turning point. As days pass, the difference becomes more pronounced. You may begin to feel waves of grief followed by moments of clarity. Memories surface, not to pull you back, but to be reprocessed without distortion. Your identity, once shaped around reactions, slowly starts to reform around choice. This is healing, even when it feels messy and nonlinear. The narcissist may appear calm or unaffected, but this is not peace. It is emotional suspension. Without external validation, they seek substitutes, distractions, or new mirrors. The silence does not deepen them. It preserves them. Mutual silence, then, is not a shared path forward. It is a fork in the road where one person begins the difficult work of disentangling and the other remains protected by avoidance, repetition, and denial. When contact ends, it is tempting to believe that what the narcissist feels is heartbreak, longing, or emotional devastation similar to your own. But what actually surfaces is something far more destabilizing for them than loss of love. What they experience is loss of control. Control over the narrative, control over access to you, control over how they are reflected and validated. This distinction is critical because it explains why their reactions often feel confusing, delayed, or oddly performative. For the narcissist, relationships are not primarily about emotional connection. They are about regulation. You became a source of stability for their self-image, someone who mirrored their importance, absorbed their volatility, and responded when they needed reassurance. When you disappear, it is not your presence they miss in its fullness. It is the function you served. The silence interrupts their ability to manage themselves through you, and that interruption creates internal chaos. At first, this may not look like pain. It may look like indifference. They may seem unbothered, distracted, or even relieved. This is not strength. It is avoidance. Narcissistic structures are designed to bypass vulnerability. So rather than feeling grief, they suppress it or convert it into irritation, contempt, or superiority. They tell themselves stories where they are unaffected, where the relationship was insignificant, where you were replaceable. These narratives are defenses, not truths. As time passes, the lack of control becomes harder to ignore. Without access to you, they cannot provoke reactions, extract reassurance, or confirm their relevance. This is when restlessness appears. They may check indirectly through others, monitor from a distance, or feel sudden urges to re-establish contact. These impulses are not driven by empathy or repair. They are driven by the discomfort of not being central in someone else's emotional world. This is why reconnection attempts often feel oddly timed and emotionally hollow. They may arrive when you have begun to stabilize, not when you were hurting most. Control is reasserted when they sense distance, not when closeness is possible. Love moves toward intimacy. Control moves toward access. Meanwhile, you are experiencing something different. You are feeling the ache of loss, the grief of what you hoped could be, and the slow dismantling of an identity shaped around someone else's needs. This pain is real, but it is also productive. It leads to insight, self-trust, and emotional expansion. The narcissist's pain, when it appears, is circular. It does not transform them. It sends them searching for new sources of control rather than inward for understanding. They are not mourning the relationship. They are mourning the loss of influence. And that is why their silence and your silence are not the same, even when they look identical from the outside. After prolonged exposure to emotional unpredictability, your nervous system adapts in ways you may not even notice while you are still inside the relationship. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Your body stays alert, scanning for shifts in tone, mood, or meaning. When contact finally stops, the mind may expect peace, but the body does not trust it yet. Instead of calm, you may feel anxious, restless, or strangely empty. This is not weakness. It is the nervous system realizing that the threat is gone but not yet believing it. For a long time, your body learned that connection came with risk. Affection could turn into withdrawal. Stability could suddenly disappear. Over time, your system stayed in a constant state of readiness, releasing stress hormones to help you cope. When the chaos ends, those hormones do not immediately shut off. The body keeps preparing for a danger that no longer arrives. This is why silence can feel uncomfortable before it feels safe. Gradually, without conscious effort, recalibration begins. Small changes appear first. You may notice that your breathing deepens when you are alone. Your shoulders relax without you telling them to. You stop checking your phone as often. These shifts are subtle, but they signal something profound. Your body is learning that it no longer has to brace itself. Safety is being relearned at a cellular level. Emotions also begin to surface differently. Feelings that were once overwhelming now come in waves rather than floods. You may cry without collapsing, feel sadness without panic, or experience anger without urgency. This is regulation returning. It is not about becoming numb or detached. It is about developing the capacity to feel without being consumed. This process can feel unsettling because chaos had become familiar. Intensity once signaled importance. When the intensity fades, the mind may misinterpret calm as emptiness. You might question whether you are healing or simply losing passion. In reality, your system is transitioning from survival mode to presence. Peace feels strange when your body has not known it for a long time. As the nervous system settles, clarity increases. You begin to see the relationship more accurately, not through fear or longing, but through grounded awareness. Memories lose their emotional charge. Triggers soften. You respond rather than react. This is not something you force or achieve through willpower. It happens because your body is no longer organized around threat. What makes this stage shocking is its quietness. There is no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden sense of triumph, just a growing steadiness, a sense of internal space, and the realization that your body is no longer living in anticipation of someone else's behavior. That is not indifference, it is recovery. In relationships shaped by narcissistic dynamics, power rarely announces itself loudly. It is embedded in patterns, in who reacts and who provokes, in who waits and who withholds. Over time, the narcissist holds power not because they are stronger, but because they are less emotionally invested in mutuality. The moment both of you stop contacting each other, something invisible yet profound begins to shift. The structure that once kept them central starts to weaken, even though no confrontation has taken place. Power in these relationships is sustained through engagement. Your responses, explanations, emotional reactions, and attempts to repair kept the dynamic alive. Even conflict served a purpose. It confirmed relevance, it proved access. When silence becomes sustained, that loop breaks. There is no audience to perform for, no emotional feedback to manipulate, no reassurance to extract. Without these inputs, the narcissist's influence quietly erodes. What makes this collapse difficult to recognize is its lack of drama. There is no final argument, no declaration of independence, no visible defeat. Instead, there is absence. And absence is destabilizing for a dynamic that relied on presence and reaction. The narcissist may still believe they hold power, may assume you will return, may feel entitled to re-enter your life at will. But entitlement is not the same as control. Control requires participation. As time passes, you begin to notice changes in yourself rather than in them. You stop arranging your thoughts around how they might respond. Decisions no longer require internal rehearsals. Emotional energy that once flowed outward begins to return inward. This is not empowerment in the performative sense. It is autonomy. And autonomy is the one thing the power dynamic could never survive. From the narcissist's perspective, the collapse often feels confusing. They may sense distance without understanding its cause. They might feel less impactful, less certain of their place in your internal world. This uncertainty is deeply unsettling because their sense of self is built on external confirmation. Without it, their influence becomes theoretical rather than real. The most shocking aspect is that the power dynamic does not reverse. You do not suddenly dominate. You do not gain leverage. The dynamic dissolves altogether. There is no winner. There is only disengagement. And disengagement removes the structure that made power possible in the first place. This is why silence can be more effective than confrontation. Confrontation keeps the relationship alive even in opposition. Silence lets it collapse under its own weight. The narcissist loses power not because you took it, but because you stopped supplying what made it exist. And once that supply ends, the dynamic cannot be rebuilt in the same way, no matter how many times they attempt to re-enter. When contact ends on both sides, absence becomes a mirror. With no messages, no reactions, no emotional exchange, the relationship is stripped down to its core truths. What often gets exposed in this quiet is not who loved more, but who depended more. Dependency hides easily in constant interaction, but it becomes unmistakable when the connection disappears. For you, absence initially feels like loss. You may miss routines, shared language, familiar emotional rhythms, but over time, you begin to notice something unexpected. Your life does not collapse. Your identity does not dissolve. You still function, still think, still feel. This realization can be both comforting and unsettling. It forces a confrontation with how much of yourself you had been bracing, adapting, or shrinking in order to stay connected. As that pressure lifts, space opens for self-recognition. The narcissist experiences absence very differently. Without your presence, there is no stabilizing reflection. They are left alone with their internal state, which is often fragmented and restless. Because their sense of worth depends heavily on external reinforcement, silence can feel like invisibility. It is not just that you are gone. It is that the role you played in confirming their importance has vanished. This creates a sense of internal instability rather than emotional mourning. What becomes clear over time is that the relationship functioned less as a mutual bond and more as a regulatory system. You were the one adapting, understanding, absorbing, and making sense of emotional chaos. When you step away, you discover that you can still self-regulate even if it takes time. The narcissist, however, must seek regulation elsewhere. New people, new conflicts, new sources of attention become necessary to fill the gap. This pattern reveals dependency without ever naming it. This exposure can be painful. You may grieve the realization that what felt like connection was, in many ways, reliance disguised as intimacy. At the same time, there is relief in understanding that the weight you carried was not proof of love, but of imbalance. Absence removes the illusion that effort equals depth. The shock lies in the asymmetry. You gain clarity and stability through separation, while the narcissist often becomes more restless, more reactive, or more entrenched in familiar patterns. The silence teaches you that your presence was not sustaining you as much as it was sustaining them. In this space, selfhood begins to reorganize. You start to feel your own emotional gravity again, no longer orbiting someone else's needs. Absence, once feared, becomes informative. It tells the truth without accusation or explanation. It shows who was anchored within themselves and who required constant connection to feel real. When growth begins after a narcissistic relationship, it rarely feels empowering at first. Instead, it often feels disorienting, flat, even wrong. This is because growth removes intensity before it introduces meaning. For a long time, emotional highs and lows may have signaled importance, closeness, or passion. When those extremes disappear, the nervous system can misinterpret stability as emptiness. The unfamiliar calm creates a strange sense of loss, not because something healthy is missing, but because something familiar no longer exists. In the early stages of separation, you may find yourself longing for feelings you know were harmful. The drama, the urgency, the constant emotional engagement once gave structure to your days and meaning to your thoughts. Without it, life can feel quieter, slower, and oddly dull. This does not mean you are regressing or secretly craving dysfunction. It means your emotional system has not yet learned how to experience fulfillment without intensity. Growth requires the shedding of identities that were built in response to someone else. You may no longer recognize the version of yourself that was always explaining, accommodating, or anticipating. As those behaviors fade, there is a temporary vacuum. You are no longer in survival mode, but you are not yet rooted in self-directed purpose. This in-between space is uncomfortable because it lacks both threat and familiarity. There can also be guilt attached to growth. Feeling better may feel like betrayal. Finding peace may seem undeserved when the other person appears unchanged or continues to struggle. This guilt keeps many people emotionally tethered long after contact ends. But growth is not an act of cruelty. It is a biological and psychological response to safety returning. As time passes, discomfort gives way to curiosity. You begin to notice what actually nourishes you rather than what distracts you. Your preferences reemerge. Boundaries stop feeling harsh and start feeling natural. You engage with others without scanning for emotional landmines. Joy becomes quieter but more durable. What makes this phase challenging is that there is no external validation for it. There is no dramatic victory, no visible transformation. Growth happens internally, often unnoticed by others. You may question whether anything meaningful is occurring because it does not announce itself. Eventually, what once felt empty begins to feel spacious. Calm becomes grounding rather than dull. Choice replaces compulsion. You realize that discomfort was not a sign that something was missing, but a sign that something new was being built. Growth felt unfamiliar because it was never allowed to exist before. When you and the narcissist both stop contacting each other, the silence can feel deceptive, as though nothing is happening at all. Yet beneath that quiet, two entirely different transformations are unfolding. One path moves toward awareness, regulation, and selfhood. The other remains anchored in control, avoidance, and repetition.